This module on the Gospel of Luke introduces the comparative method for studying the Gospels. This approach works very much like redaction criticism. It explores the similarities and differences between the stories and different texts in order to identify the author's emphases. Unlike the redactional approach, the comparative method is not primarily concerned with the identification of literary sources, so whether or not Luke uses Mark or Q or some other sort of material. The Gospel of Luke, like Matthew and Mark, is a Greco-Roman biography that was written anonymously by a Greek speaker. Like Matthew and Luke, this author most likely lived outside of Palestine. It's not unreasonable to think that this author also lived in the region of Syria, just as did the author of the Gospel of Matthew. The author of Luke also wrote the Acts of the Apostles. The book of Acts really is volume 2 of Luke's Gospel. The Gospel tells about Jesus' birth, his life, his death, his resurrection appearances, and the book of Acts, as you already know, traces the spread of Christianity through the Roman Empire, documents the missionary activity of Paul, and concludes with Paul under house arrest in the city of Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire. Luke's Gospel begins with a formal historiographic preface. In my reading outline, I give you some examples of the historiographic preface that Josephus writes to one of his works so that you compare what you find in the Gospel of Luke. The author, that is Luke, acknowledges his sources. He notes that others have told this story, but he promises to record it in an orderly fashion. The preface dedicates the work to a certain Theophilus. Scholars have debated about the meaning of this dedication. Was Theophilus a person to whom Luke wrote an apology, that is, an irrational defense of the Jesus movement? Or does Theophilus, whose name literally means beloved of God or friend of God, does Theophilus refer to the Christian community for whom Luke wrote? This historiographic preface is interesting because it makes clear that Luke is not an eyewitness of the events about which he is writing, nor is he even one of the early Christian missionaries. Rather, he identifies himself as a traditioner, someone who has followed these events, who has collected resources and traditions, and who has ordered them. He is a traditioner. He's put them in an orderly manner so that this patron, Theophilus or the Christian community, can have this at their disposal for their particular use. Although the basic narrative is the same in both Matthew and Luke, when we look at the opening of the Gospel to Luke's account of the birth narrative of Jesus, we find several differences. Jesus is born in Bethlehem, to be sure, to a virgin named Mary, who is betrothed to Joseph. But from there the stories differ. For example, Matthew has magi, the wise men, while Luke has shepherds. In Matthew, the angel speaks to Joseph, and Luke, the angel speaks to Mary. Matthew records a flight to Egypt. Luke records a journey to Bethlehem. Luke's gospel shows that God's salvation is available to the entire world. In his genealogy, which comes later in Luke's birth narrative, Luke traces Jesus' heritage not to David, not to Abraham, not even to Adam, the first human, but to Adam's father, to God. While Luke's genealogy does identify Jesus as a descendant of important Jewish leaders, it also suggests that Jesus belongs not simply to the Jews, but to the entire world. Unlike Matthew and Mark, Luke begins Jesus' public ministry with the story of Jesus speaking in the synagogue in his hometown. In his sermon, Jesus presents himself as a prophet. The Jews were offended by his words, Luke tells us, and tried to kill him. The story summarizes a major feature of Luke's narrative, both in the Gospel and in the book of Acts. The message is first offered to Jews who reject it, and then, and then it is taken to Gentiles. Luke depicts Jesus as a prophet sent by God. Hebrew prophets were opposed, they were rejected and often killed by people to whom they were sent. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus is born as a prophet, he performs miracles as a prophet, he realizes that he will die as a prophet. Whereas in Mark's Gospel, Jesus dies in traumatic agony, saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In Luke's Gospel, Jesus knows that he must die and shows no doubt that it is a necessity. It is God's will. His final words on the cross are, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Jesus then is rejected by his people and killed as a prophet. His death is related to salvation, but salvation is not brought by Jesus' death per se. It is not described as a sacrifice as it is in Mark's Gospel. Rather, Jesus' death is that of an innocent prophet. It elicits guilt and repentance for responsibility in that death. It is a repentance that brings forgiveness and salvation. Repentance, forgiveness, God's mercy is a triad that is repeated over and over and over again in Luke's Gospel. Those are three key Lucan words: repentance, forgiveness, mercy. Luke emphasizes Jesus' importance for Gentiles. Although this is a primary theme in Luke's second volume, the Acts of the Apostles, Jesus' importance for Gentiles is apparent already in the Gospel according to Luke. The mission to the Gentiles, moreover, is understood as a part of God's divine plan. Indeed, God is a significant actor in Luke's stories of Jesus and in the spread of Christianity throughout the empire. In Luke, Jesus does not preach about an imminent end. The eschatological element, the apocalyptic tenor, is toned down in Luke's Gospel. The end will occur after the mission to the Gentiles is complete. Jesus comes not so much at the end of time in Luke's Gospel as he does in the middle of history, to inaugurate a new era of repentance, forgiveness, and mercy that extends to the Gentiles. And because the Gentiles occupy the entire empire, time is required for that message, that opportunity for forgiveness and mercy to extend to all the Gentiles. It is perhaps because of this delay that Luke's Gospel also has an emphasis upon Jesus' concern for social justice and for righting the wrongs at the present time. A comparison with Luke and Mark and Matthew reveals a number of distinctive emphases. I have tried to summarize those in my reading outline, and as we read the Gospel looking ahead to the second volume, to the book of Acts, which we'll take up at the end of the week, it's important to keep in mind for the author of Luke that the idea of a worldwide mission to both Jews and Gentiles was always a part of God's plan.